Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. You know, the event that's always called the spark that started World War I.
Right.
We've got some fascinating stuff to look at, including a transcript from a YouTube video from the War Friends channel, ready to uncover some historical surprises.
Absolutely. It's way more than just a trigger event, though. We'll really have to peel back the layers to see how complex this whole period was. You know, nationalism, imperialism, secret societies.
Yeah.
It's like a historical thriller.
It really is. Okay, so let's start with the basics. It's 1914. Europe's already a tinderbox.
Yeah.
Our sources paint a picture of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Not just some royal figurehead, but a man who inherited a lot of wealth and power, and it all came from a series of, well, pretty dramatic events.
Yeah, definitely dramatic.
So fill us in on that. What happened?
Okay, so Franz Ferdinand's path to becoming the heir. It wasn't straightforward at all. His cousin, Francis V, died really young and left him a fortune. Then, Crown Prince Rudolf, another cousin, committed suicide.
Wow. And then, like adding to the whole tragedy, Franz's own father died. Typhoid fever in 1896.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly, he's the heir apparent, thrust into the spotlight, inherits all this responsibility.
It really does sound like something out of Shakespeare, not the setup for a world war.
Right.
But obviously there's a lot more going on here than just palace intrigue, right?
Huh?
What was happening outside of Austro-Hungary,
Yeah.
particularly what was going on in Serbia.
Well, Serbia was going through this huge surge of nationalism,
Okay.
driven by their dream of a greater Serbia. So basically expanding their territory.
Okay.
They'd had some military victories recently, and that just fueled those ambitions even more.
So we've got a powerful Archduke coming into this really tense Europe with a Serbian nationalist movement that's gaining momentum.
Mm-hmm.
It already sounds like a recipe for conflict. Absolutely. And as this greater Serbia, it wasn't just some political goal, it was a deeply held aspiration for a lot of Serbs. And this is where groups like Young Bosnia and, even more importantly, the Black Hand come into the picture.
The Black Hand. Now, their methods were a little more direct, shall we say.
Let's just say their approach to achieving this greater Serbia wasn't exactly diplomatic.
Right.
They were all about terrorism assassinations. Their motto was unification or death.
Wow. That gives you a pretty clear picture of their commitment.
For sure.
But how influential were they? Were they just a fringe group, or did they actually have some real power?
That's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. They weren't just some isolated group. They had connections within the Serbian government, which makes it even more complex and really raises questions about how much the government knew or maybe even was involved with their activities.
Okay, so we've got the scene set. A powerful Archduke, a Europe that's on edge, Serbian nationalism, and then this secret society that's totally willing to resort to violence.
It's a volatile mix.
It really is. Tell us about the guys the Black Hand chose for this assassination.
So the Black Hand was led by this mysterious figure just known as Apis. And they saw Archduke Franz Ferdinand as a direct threat to their vision.
Okay.
They thought he was going to try and appease the Slavs in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which would totally undermine their goal of a greater Serbia. So they chose 3 young men, Gavrilo Princip, Nedeljko Obrenović, and Trifko Grabish.
It's hard to imagine entrusting such a huge, dangerous task to just, well, young guys. What kind of training did they even get?
Well, the training was pretty limited, to be honest. They didn't have a lot of resources, mostly just basic instruction on firearms, grenades. They managed a few practice shots in a park outside Belgrade.
Oh, wow.
And on May 26th, they were given the tools for the job, Browning pistols, grenades, and they even got cyanide pills. Probably for a quick escape or maybe as a last resort.
Oh, wow. Equipped, but not exactly seasoned assassins, would you say?
Right.
It sounds like a powder keg about to blow. So what happened when the Archduke arrived in Sarajevo?
It was June 28th, 1914. The Archduke and his wife, Sophie, they arrive in Sarajevo for a whole day of public appearances.
Okay.
You'd think with all the tension, security would be tight, but it was surprisingly lax.
That's surprising.
Really set the stage for what was about to happen.
Yeah. So what happened next? Did the assassins try to carry out their plan right away?
As the motorcade was going through Sarajevo, the first attempt happened. One of the assassins, Obrenović, he throws a grenade at the Archduke's car.
So the plan was in motion. Did it hit?
It's crazy, but it bounced off the car and exploded under another vehicle. A few people were injured, but the Archduke was unharmed. Obrenović, thinking he'd failed, swallowed his cyanide pill and jumped into a river nearby.
A daring escape attempt. Did he get away? Did the cyanide work?
That's where things get even more strange. The cyanide pill was old, didn't really work, just made him vomit.
Oh.
And to make things worse, the river he jumped into almost dried up because of the summer heat.
Oh, no.
He was caught quickly.
A series of unfortunate events for him. So the Archduke, after this close call, he survives the bombing. What happened next? Did he just call it a day?
Despite all the chaos, he wanted to continue the visit. Changed the schedule a bit, though.
Okay.
He wanted to visit the people who were injured in the bombing at the hospital. But as the motorcade was heading there, fate kind of stepped in. The driver took a wrong turn and stalled the car, right in front of Gavrilo Princip, who was just waiting there.
Wow. It's like something out of a movie. Just a crazy series of events that led to this unfortunate coincidence.
So what did Princip do, seeing the Archduke's car right there?
He saw his chance and took it. He fired 2 shots. One hit the Archduke in the neck, and the other mortally wounded his wife, Sophie.
Wow. A chilling moment in history, this whole cascade of events culminating in this tragic act. So what happened next? Did Austria-Hungary immediately blame Serbia?
The aftermath was instant. Anti-Serb riots broke out all across the Austro-Hungarian Empire,
Yeah.
fueled by grief, anger, wanting revenge. I can imagine. So what was their official response to the Serbian government?
Austria-Hungary was convinced that the Serbian government was involved somehow, at least complicit in what the Black Hand did. They saw this assassination as a direct attack on their sovereignty, and they were determined to make Serbia pay.
So imagine that's where diplomacy, at least attempts at it, come in. Were there any efforts to de-escalate?
Oh, there were, but the whole situation was so delicate. Almost a month after the assassination, on July 23rd, Austria-Hungary issued Serbia an ultimatum. It was basically a list of demands that were, well, almost impossible for Serbia to meet.
What were some of those demands? Were they directly related to the Black Hand or more general?
They were pretty far-reaching, targeting both the Black Hand and Serbia's sovereignty.
Okay.
They demanded that Serbia suppress all anti-Austrian propaganda, remove specific officials from their posts, and this was the most controversial one, they wanted their own officials to participate in the investigation inside Serbia, which was basically saying, we don't trust you to do it yourselves.
Yeah, that's a huge infringement on their independence. So what did Serbia do?
You know, it's surprising, but Serbia agreed to most of the demands. But they refused to let Austria-Hungary conduct investigations on their soil. They saw that as just unacceptable.
So even with Serbia trying to negotiate, things still blew up.
Yeah.
It seems like that assassination really set off an unstoppable chain of events.
It really did. Diplomatic efforts failed, and on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. And because of this whole web of alliances, what seemed like a contained conflict quickly escalated into a global war.
Okay, so this is where things get really intricate. The alliances. Remind us who is aligned with whom and how these alliances played into that rapid escalation.
Sure. Europe at the time was basically split into 2 big power blocks.
Oh.
The Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy.
Right.
And then the Triple Entente. That was Russia, France, and Great Britain.
So when Austria-Hungary declared war, did their allies jump in right away?
Yeah, pretty much. Germany, because of their alliance with Austria-Hungary, immediately pledged their full support. And Russia, with their strong ties to Serbia, mobilized their army to defend them. And that, in turn, led Germany to declare war on Russia.
Oh, wow.
That was on August 1st, and then on France just 2 days later.
It's incredible how quickly this regional conflict in the Balkans turned into this major war involving all the major powers of Europe. Was it just the alliances, or were there other factors that led to that rapid escalation?
The alliances definitely played a huge role, but some of Germany's strategic decisions also contributed to the expansion.
Okay.
They wanted to defeat France quickly, so they decided to invade neutral Belgium.
And that's what brought Great Britain into the war. Right. Because they'd promised to protect Belgium's neutrality.
Exactly. Germany invading Belgium forced Great Britain to declare war on August 4th.
Wow.
They had to honor their commitment, and then it was like a domino effect. Japan joined the Allied side. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. By the end of 1914, what started as this regional conflict had engulfed most of Europe and beyond.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
One event, the assassination of one person, having such huge consequences.
It really shows you how fragile peace is, the dangers of unchecked nationalism, militarism. It makes you think about all the other things going on at the time.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there.
You mentioned the Black Hand's long-term influence, and it's true their tactics were shocking. But they weren't completely new. Political assassinations, they had been used before.
Right.
But what the Black Hand did was they kind of brought that kind of violence to the forefront of global politics. It had this ripple effect.
Yeah, it makes you think about their impact beyond just the war breaking out.
Yeah.
Did they inspire similar movements in other parts of the world?
It's hard to say for sure if they directly inspired anyone, but they set a precedent.
Right.
In the years after World War I, you see this rise in nationalist and anti-colonial movements. And they were also willing to use violence to get what they wanted. The Black Hand showed that even a small group, if they act decisively, could disrupt like the whole world order.
So, even though many people condemn their actions, they might have emboldened other groups who were looking for radical change.
Definitely.
Adds another layer of complexity to this whole period.
For sure. It also makes you think about how we define terrorism.
Yeah.
How our views on violence change depending on the context, and who's doing it and why. But let's step back for a second and look at the bigger picture, the forces at play before World War I. We've talked about nationalism, but what about imperialism?
Yeah, good point. It wasn't just about territorial disputes in Europe. There was this global power struggle going on.
Right.
Explain how that imperial rivalry played a role in setting the stage for war.
Imagine Europe's major powers, like they're players in this high-stakes game.
Okay, like that.
Each one trying to get the most valuable pieces on the board. And those pieces, colonies in Africa and Asia, rich in resources, strategically important. This competition for colonies created so much friction, so much mistrust between the empires.
So it was about more than just land. It was about resources, power, global prestige.
Absolutely.
How did that competition actually play out in those years leading up to 1914? Were there any specific incidents, flashpoints that really ramped up the tension?
Oh, there were several. The two Moroccan crises in the early 1900s, where Germany challenged France's influence in Morocco, those almost brought Europe to war.
Wow.
It showed just how quickly a colonial dispute could turn into a major international conflict.
Europe was a powder keg, ready to explode.
Exactly.
And this competition wasn't just between empires. It affected the countries within them too, right?
Yeah.
How did that play out in Austria-Hungary, with all its different ethnic groups and their nationalist aspirations?
Austria-Hungary was a really complicated case. This multinational empire, Slavs, Hungarians, Germans, all with their own identities, their own goals. The empire trying to hold it all together with all these nationalist movements growing stronger created internal tensions that just made things even more unstable.
So Austria-Hungary was dealing with pressure from both inside and outside, making them even more vulnerable when the assassination happened. So the assassination was this catalyst igniting a conflict that was already simmering under the surface.
Exactly. It was the match that lit the fuse, but the explosives were already there. The alliances, the competition for colonies, nationalism, it all created this environment where conflict was almost inevitable.
It's a very different picture than just seeing the assassination as the only cause of the war.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the lead up to the war, but I'm curious about what happened afterward to the assassins. What was their fate?
Yeah, that often gets lost in the bigger story. So let's rewind back to right after the assassination. Remember Gavrilo Princip, the one who fired the shots? He was caught right there. And our sources tell us there were others involved in the plot. What happened to them? Did they all manage to, do what they were supposed to do?
That's what I was wondering.
Well, not all the assassins were as, shall we say, effective as Princip.
Okay.
Some of them got nervous, froze up when it was time to act. Others, they just messed up their part of the plan.
It sounds like even though the whole thing was planned out, the actual execution was pretty chaotic.
It was.
So what happened to them after they were caught?
Because they were so young, Princip and the two others who went to Sarajevo with him, they weren't sentenced to death, but they got the maximum sentence. 20 years in prison.
20 years is still a long time, especially when you're that young. Were the prison conditions particularly bad back then?
They were. The prison where Princip was held, it was known for being brutal. He got tuberculosis and died just 4 years into his sentence.
That's a tragic end to a life marked by that act. What about the others involved? The ones who planned it, supported it. Were they held accountable?
Several members of the Black Hand, including their leader, Atis, were eventually arrested and put on trial. In Serbia.
That's interesting. The Black Hand was a secret society. How did they even find out who the members were?
Remember, we talked about them having connections within the Serbian government, how much the government knew about the assassination or was involved. That's still debated.
Right.
But it's clear that some people in the government knew, or at least suspected, something was going on.
So there were all these layers of political intrigue, maybe even reaching the highest levels of government.
Exactly. And the trial itself was really controversial.
I bet.
There were accusations of political motivations, people trying to protect certain individuals. But in the end, several members, including Apis, were found guilty and executed in 1917.
The trial itself became another flashpoint then, showing all the tensions, power struggles that were already there.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history isn't always black and white. There are always shades of gray, different sides to the story, unanswered questions. That's what makes it so interesting to study.
It makes you think about how events like this can expose the cracks in a society and have consequences that no one could have predicted.
Absolutely. And it brings up even more questions about the assassination itself.
Like what?
Like, how much did the assassins actually understand about what they were doing?
Right.
Did they know what they were setting in motion? Did they foresee this global conflict?
It's hard to imagine they could have grasped the scale of it all.
Right.
It makes you wonder about individual choices versus the forces of history.
For sure. It also makes you think about the what ifs. What if Franz Ferdinand had lived? Would the war have happened anyway?
That's the question, isn't it? Historians have been debating that for over a century. It's impossible to know for sure.
It is. But it's a question worth asking. It highlights how complex historical causation is, the role of chance. Even in a world that seems to be driven by these powerful forces, individual actions, even seemingly small events, can change the course of history.
It's a reminder that everything is connected and that peace is a fragile thing. We've talked about the assassins, their motives, what happened to them. We've explored those alliances, the competition between empires that led to war. And we've even touched on those bigger questions about history and what might have been.
We've covered a lot, but there's always more to learn.
Always.
It's like, how did the assassination affect public opinion in different countries? How did it shape the stories that were used to justify the war?
That's a great point. Understanding how the event was perceived, how it was used for political purposes, that adds another layer to our understanding.
Right.
Let's delve into those questions and more when we come back for the final part of our deep dive.
You were talking about how the assassination affected public opinion, and it's really interesting how it was portrayed, almost manipulated, to shape people's views and support the war.
It makes you think about the power of propaganda, how easy it is to sway public opinion, especially when there's a crisis going on. So how was the assassination used in that way in the lead up to the war?
Well, in a lot of countries, it was portrayed as this barbaric act, a reason to rally behind your country, support the war effort.
Right.
Governments used it to demonize their enemies, stir up patriotic feelings. Like in Austro-Hungary, it was used to fuel anti-Serbian sentiment. Serbs were painted as dangerous, untrustworthy.
So it became a justification for war,
Right.
playing on existing prejudices and fears. Were there any dissenting voices at all? Anyone who questioned the official narrative or the rush to war?
Oh, there were some, but they were kind of drowned out by the wave of nationalism and this war fever that was gripping everyone.
Yeah.
Some socialist and pacifist groups, they argued that the assassination was just an excuse for a war that really served the interests of the ruling class, the elites. They pointed to the imperial rivalries, the economic competition, as the real reasons behind the conflict.
It's interesting that they were already making those connections, seeing the bigger picture. But it seems like their message didn't get through to most people.
It didn't, not at the time.
Yeah.
The emotional impact of the assassination, plus the propaganda from the governments, it was just too powerful. It wasn't really until after the war, when the true scale of the devastation became clear, that people started to question the narratives that led them into the conflict.
It's a reminder that even smart people can abandon critical thinking when they're afraid and uncertain. Looking back, it's obvious that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a pivotal event. But it wasn't the only cause of World War I.
Definitely not. It was a catalyst, the spark. But the powder keg was already there.
Right.
To really understand why World War I happened, you have to consider nationalism, imperialism, and those complex alliances that have been building for decades.
It shows that history is rarely simple. There are always multiple perspectives, hidden motivations, a web of factors that all come together. It's also a stark reminder of the human cost of war and how important it is to find peaceful solutions to international disputes.
Absolutely. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it.
Right.
By studying history, by understanding what led to those conflicts, we can hopefully avoid making the same mistakes.
It's a call to action for all of us to think critically, question what we're told, and to advocate for peace and diplomacy.
I agree. We have to remember that even when things seem inevitable, there are always other possibilities, other outcomes.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. As always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.